Good morning, Nolan.
Yeah, perfect. I'm clear.
that? We'll get you a nameplate soon.
This one here?
I would have done it both of us. That's a guarantee. Oh, you don't need.
Oh, I don't need more?
Although you can take some of these. Yeah, just put those.
Yeah, I guess.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, do you see how these are on the?
Yeah, we'll be around. We've met in person. Mary Winnefeld.
Oh, hi. Nice
Nice to meet you. Stanley. We've met. I'm Stephanie Keegan. Until last night, I didn't know I was. Okay, now I'm the whole time here. If I grab you, Gary.
He is. He is.
No, I know Dawn and Eric,
Of course.
Yeah.
Mike, that was a good hour last night. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, my constituent's going to join us via video
Okay.
from my district office.
I think if I can ask everyone to take their seats so we can be respectful of everyone's time and get started. And just to set the stage a little bit, this is, of course, the Energy and Commerce Committee. This roundtable is being conducted by the Subcommittee on Health, but we will have members of the full committee who are not subcommittee members, and they will obviously be permitted to make statements or ask questions as time permits. The This format is different from a hearing, and that is on purpose, to be a little less formal and allow for the interchange of ideas, but just so that our witnesses know, our guests know what we have been doing at the committee level. Chairman Greg Walden, who's the chairman of the full committee, has tasked the Health Subcommittee several months ago with being much more aggressive in looking into this problem, learning about this problem, and developing solutions. So we are probably a week away from a major markup of some legislative vehicles, but we did think it was important to hear from people whose lives had been directly affected before we got to that step. Last October, we opened the doors up of the committee room to any member of Congress, members of the full committee, members of the subcommittee, any member of Congress who wanted to come and talk to us about what they were seeing as far as how the opiate crisis was affecting their district, or if they had ideas as to potential solutions. We wanted to hear from them. We were here for several hours, and we heard from 54 or 55 members of Congress from around the country, and as you might imagine, had a variety of opinions. Working through that now has led to the 67 legislative products that are under consideration by the committee. They will not all make it. They will not all be signed into law. Some will be consolidated, some will drop off, but your input this morning is a valuable step in the process. So I want to thank, I know some of you traveled a great distance. Ms. O'Keefe is from my area of North Texas and has worked very hard in this. I actually learned of her from reading about her in my newspaper back home, and I thought she'd be a valuable addition to the hearing today, the roundtable today. So thank you for coming and sharing with us. And I'd now like to recognize the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee, Mr. Gene Green from Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, like my chair of the committee said, I can talk loud enough. That's part of our training. But thank you for holding this roundtable hearing, because it isn't more informal instead of swearing in witnesses and being so formal. And I want to thank all the participants for coming this morning and sharing your powerful and personal opioid stories. As a father and grandfather, I can't imagine the pain of our brave participants having experienced losing a child or a grandchild to the opioids crisis. Tragically, our participants today are far from alone. The CDC estimates that lives of 115 Americans are lost every day to opioids. While Congress, federal agencies, and state officials have taken action in recent years, more must be done to ensure that the Americans suffering from opioid use disorder have access to high-quality continuum of care necessary to treat and recover from opioid abuse. One bill I believe would help and make differences is a Comprehensive Opioid Recovery Act, Centers Act, H.R. 5237, that I'm sponsoring with my colleague Brett Guthrie from Kentucky, who's on our committee. This legislation would fund designated treatment centers where individuals will receive comprehensive patient-centered care for opioid addiction and other substance abuse disorders. The bill focused on developing model practices for treatment and recovery that can be duplicated nationwide. As our committee considers legislation in the coming weeks, I ask that we pursue policies like the Comprehensive Opioid Recovery Centers Act that will expand access to the high-quality care that Americans are struggling with substance abuse deserve. And I want to thank Ms. O'Keefe, coming from a very urban area in Houston, and just like in Denton, our Harris County Jail is the predominant mental health care and controlled substances. We actually, I think, have a whole separate building for that in an urban area. So thank you for your witness, your testimony, and all of you for being here today.
Thank you, Mr. Green, and we'll hear from the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Greg Walden from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues for being here today, and I especially want to thank all of you for being here. I cannot imagine how difficult this is for you, but we all share that it's important. And as I mentioned to some of you beforehand, Chairman Burgess and this subcommittee and our full committee and our oversight committee have been working on this issue for well over a year. And we've had 3 sets of hearings, one looking at how do we stop illegal fentanyl and synthetic opioids from getting into our country, getting into our communities. How do we help people that are addicted, and what can we do in our communities, and what works and what doesn't. And then the third piece was how do we fund a lot of this, because a lot of it's through Medicare, a lot of it's through Medicaid, and then of course others. And so we've completed those sets of hearings, and this is the really, I think, probably the most important one, because you all have been there in the trenches. You have lived this terrible tragedy that's befallen our country. We've quadrupled opioid deaths since 1999. More people die from opioid overdose in America than traffic accidents. That is why it's my top priority on this committee, and why we're focused. We are also joined today, and I don't know if we can bring her up on the screen, is Paula Petersen from Grants Pass, Oregon. Good morning, Paula. Thank you for joining us. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. Good morning.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And we won't necessarily have you on display here the entire 2 hours, so don't feel like the camera's always on. I had a round table, one of many in my district, and Paula was there with her son and told a very, very powerful story about what her family is going through right now. And so, Paula, thank you for joining us via video conference. As the chairman said, we will likely go into markup next week in this very room on these pieces of legislation and move forward, hopefully finish our committee's work by Memorial Day and have these bills on the floor sometime in early June. We're also in communication, coordination with our counterparts in the Senate and other committees in the Congress, but we have principal jurisdiction here, and our members are very committed, as you'll hear today, and our work will benefit greatly by your counsel and your input. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I thank our witnesses. I thank you and Mr. Green for your leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, we do want to welcome and thank our witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before our subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give a summary of their remarks, and then we'll have time for questions and answers from members. Ed Kim behind me is going to keep a queue so that if I'm not, catch his eye, not mine, if you wish to ask a question, but we won't go in the formal order that we would normally go in a subcommittee hearing. We'll keep a queue for that. So today we're going to hear from, as the chairman has pointed out, Ms. Paula Petersen, who's joining us via teleconference, Ms. Kathy O'Keefe from the North Texas area, Mr. Gary Mandel, Ms. Mary Winnefield, Ms. Devon Hott, Amy Dar Pino, is that right? Mr. Michael Gray, Ms. Lisa Daniels, Ms. Gayle Smith, and we appreciate you being here today. And Ms. Petersen, why don't we start with you via the teleconference, and you're recognized for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Pallone, and other distinguished members of the Energy and Commerce Committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. My name is Paula Petersen, and I live in Grants Pass, Oregon. I am a middle-class American mom. My husband and I have 2 sons together, Cole, who's 27 and lives in Eugene, and Jacob, 24, who lives with us. I also have a stepson, 38, and a grandson, 18, that live in the Portland area. Cole, my oldest, recently spoke with me at a roundtable meeting in Grants Pass where we met Representative Walden. Cole gave me permission to share his story. He started using oxycodone occasionally around 15 or 16. It was freely available from 2 or 3 of his friends whose parents or grandparents had stockpiled unused pain medications. When the formula for oxy got switched so that it couldn't be crushed to smoke or snort, they looked for other sources. At that time, he was living in a neighborhood where heroin was plentiful. He was not alone. Almost all of his friends got hooked on heroin. These were and are good kids. 2 of his close friends are lost to the streets or to jail. The others are on Suboxone, including Cole. He spent 2 to 3 years on oxy and then 4 to 5 years on heroin. We did send him to treatment, but he continued to use after that. He finally got off heroin and has been clean for 3 years using Suboxone, though he has typically bought it illegally. The only people he knows that have ever gotten off of heroin have done it using Suboxone. He is currently working, has a girlfriend, and feels very hopeful about life. He has an appointment next week to get Suboxone from a doctor, which would be great for him to not have to buy it on the streets. My second son, Jacob, 24, followed in his brother's footsteps. He's currently working and is on Suboxone, which he buys on the streets. He has not exhausted all possibilities to get a prescription from a doctor. When he first moved back in with us, he tried to get off of Suboxone, but could not handle the withdrawal symptoms. My stepson in the Portland area had a near brush with death recently. He has used opiates on and off, again for pain, and has been at times addicted. I'm not completely sure of his history. Addicts tend to be very secretive. One night, a few weeks ago, he had been drinking and called a buddy looking for Vicodin. All that was available was heroin in a needle. Later that night, my grandson heard voices and went downstairs and found EMTs bent over his dad. It took 4 doses of Narcan to bring him back. He is doing fine now, and my grandson is a superstar. Thank goodness his buddy called 911 and that those EMTs had Narcan readily available. So what am I doing? I attend a support group called Families Anonymous. It is a national support group devoted to helping people with family members or loved ones who are addicted to drugs or alcohol. We have a lot of parents and grandparents who are looking for help because this is a family disease and we all need to recover. We are working to shift the stigma. It's not other families that have the problem. It is our friends and our families. We have to overcome the shame so that we can help each other. Before drafting my testimony, my son Cole and I talked about what might help the most as Congress tries to address this crisis. We hope we can make Suboxone and other forms of medication-assisted treatment more readily available, and, of course, the full continuum of treatment. The more you have to wait to get access treatment, which is already a very difficult decision, the more likely you are to fall back into that addiction. We also need to remove the stigma of substance abuse. We can't be afraid to ask for help. And more research is needed on the changes that happen to the brain for addicts. I appreciate the work that the committee is doing to make progress on these issues. We have a potential to make a difference for families like mine, and that's the most important thing. Thank you for inviting me to participate, and I look forward to your questions.
We thank you for participating. Ms. O'Keefe, you're recognized, please.
On these mics, you kind of have to hold down the button a little and then let it go, and a red light should come on. We have staff that can assist, I assume.
You would think as the major technology committee of the United States House of Representatives, we would not require 12-year-olds to turn on our mics, but we do. There you go. You're good.
Yeah, there's just a little delay.
My name is Kathy O'Keefe. This is my son, Brett. We lost him on March 20th of 2010. He had just turned 18 years old. He overdosed 3 times within a year. Basically, he was using heroin for a year, and within that year, he overdosed 3 times. The first time he overdosed, he had just turned 17. We were in the hospital for 5 days. We were in ICU for 3 of those days. When we came out, the insurance company told us that he did not need treatment because it was just the first time that he overdosed from heroin. All he needed was counseling. That was wrong. We found ourselves back in ICU, again, about 4 months later, 5 months later, and it was a much worse overdose this time. He was in ICU for 6.5 days. 5.5 days of that, he was on a ventilator. We got released. We went to rehab. The hospital bill alone was $826,000. Of that money, $125,000 was just medication, and he was on a ventilator all that time. We left there and we went to rehab. We were in rehab for 42 days, and in that 42 days, every day cost $1,500. We left rehab, we went to IOP, which is intensive outpatient therapy. We did that for 6 weeks, and that was $1,500 a week. So the cost adding up was just phenomenal. Insurance company, of course, did not pay for all of that, and as it turned out, my husband and I had to file bankruptcy. Just about a year ago, we finished paying off a 5-year bankruptcy, and our son has been dead 8 years. So even though Brett's dead, we still are paying off his medical bills. That's a problem. But I'm not here just because of my son, Brett. I'm here because every one of these pictures is a family that is lost. Last night, as I was preparing for this, I laid out all of these pictures. I laid out all these pictures of all these families. There's a lot of pain. There's a lot of problems here. These are kids that is coming in from Mexico. That has to stop. We have to support what we have now. If we have people that are addicted to drugs, we have to stop the stigma so they'll come forward and come get the help that they need. And I'm not saying everybody needs, you can get sober in the rooms. You can get sober, not everybody has to go to treatment. I'd love to see everybody in treatment, but that's just not feasible. We can't financially do that. There's other ways we have to be able to support. We don't have support for the families. Look how many out of this, look how many people are raising their grandchildren. They have no support. They need their support. The children need the support. Parents that are out using and grandparents are raising their grandchildren while their daughter or whatever is out using in an addiction, they need support. Those kids need to know that their parents love them. They're not healthy. And we need that. We need to help these people. And not all of it takes money. A lot of it just takes some of us just coming forward and saying, let's start a support group. Let's try this, let's try that. When Brett was in treatment, never once did somebody come and say, there is a drug that we can give him. There was no mat available for Brett in 2010. There were drugs available, but they weren't encouraging that. We have to come forward and we have to bring them drugs. If it's not working, if they relapse because it's in there, that urge is in there, let's give them the opportunity. Let's give them a drug to stop that craving. We have mothers, every 28 minutes an infant is born in the United States addicted to opiates. We have to stop that because the mothers go home and the babies stay in the hospital for a long period of time. The cost of that is phenomenal. And yet we still need volunteers. People want to help. We need volunteers to go to the hospital and hold those babies while they go through withdrawal. And here the mothers are on medication and they're still stigmatized. A lot of those mothers are on methadone, and even though they're on methadone during their pregnancy so that they're not craving and going out and using more, they still have babies that are addicted to drugs. So we kind of have a lot of things. This is such a multifaceted unit. There's so many things that we can do. There's a lot of things that have to be done, and we all have to come together. This all has to be a nationwide thing. These are our families. These are families. They're not statistics. They're not numbers. They're families. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mandel, you're recognized. In this setting, we are not going to use a clock. I will not interrupt you. So you're recognized. Normally, I would say for 5 minutes, but you're recognized, and we're anxious to hear from you. Yes.
Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green, Chairman Walden, and all our distinguished members of Congress here today. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here and share my family's story and thoughts of how we can reverse this epidemic. On October 20th, 2011, I lost my son Brian to addiction. And like many other children, as you'll hear today, Brian tried marijuana for the first time when he was 13 or 14 or 15 which led to him progressing and battling the disease of addiction for almost 10 years. My family thought to navigate this confusing web of treatment programs and therapies to help Brian. But despite our efforts and Brian trying his hardest, I received that phone call in the middle of that night, which is every parent's worst nightmare, telling me that my son had just died. But even more tragic, which I really want to express and be heard today, it wasn't just addiction that took my son's life. It was him waking up every single morning throughout that 8 or 10 years and feeling the shame he felt, being stigmatized as that bad kid, which caused him to wake up that morning, research suicide notes, write a note to myself and the rest of our family, light a candle, and take his own life. He was 25 years old, and he hadn't used a substance in 13 months. It was about the shame and the stigma. And he also wrote a paragraph about the treatment system, how it was outdated, not using the right things, and that a little joke we had between us that I was always going to listen to them because they were the professionals, and he understood it. But he couldn't go on with being within this treatment system that was all giving him different advice, every single treatment program, not being treated like a patient, treating like an outcast. In the aftermath of Brian's death, I struggled to make sense of what had happened. And I really started to learn some things that I was unaware of that when Brian was alive. Because when Brian was alive, I was just so focused on Brian. But now I was starting to give thought to how did this happen and how could we prevent it from happening to others? And
I come from a family of addiction. Parents lost a cousin to this disease in 2013. I had trauma as a child. While none of those things make me an addict, I learned at a young age, I didn't learn at a young age how to cope and deal with life. And drugs became my solution to life, my escape. I started experimenting at a very young age, and then it became recreational. The usage picked up with time, and I was in the crowd of people that that was the thing that was going on. That was the thing that was happening, for me, it just never stopped. And the recreational use became an everyday use, and it was waking up every single morning, not knowing a different way of life, and actually needing it and being physically addicted to opiates and pills. And it was, I didn't have a prescription, but I would go to the doctors. I would try to say that, I would legitimately have a reason or pain, but, they would try to give me ibuprofen, 800 milligrams, something of that nature, and I would say, well, that kind of upsets my stomach, or I'd give some type of excuse and reason to get something, some type of narcotic, something that I was actually seeking and wanted. This went on for a very long time. The usage picked up and became more and more frequent. I needed more pills, higher dosage, those kinds of things. And eventually, I knew that I had a problem. I knew that I needed help, and I was ready to do something about it. I was ready to do something different. So I was suggested to go to a psychiatrist and try to get on Suboxone. And so I did that. That was back in September of 2010. And I went in, and the doctor, he didn't screen me. He didn't give me any type of urinalysis screening. He just basically said, here you go, we'll start you off on Suboxone at this dosage. And I started stepping down, every month, and doing pretty well with it. And for the job that I had at the time, I was asked to go to Afghanistan. And while I was over there, I stayed longer than intended. My dosage stayed the same. We didn't change it. And I came back with some PTSD. And so not only when I came back, I was I was basically given more medications, you know, and my doctor at that point became my drug dealer. And my legal drug dealer is what it felt like. And I justified it that way, that he's a doctor, he knows what he's doing, he knows how to help me. But he never recommended any type of treatment for me. He just kept giving me basically what I asked for and what I you know, I'd say I'd have this problem, he'd prescribe some other type of medications, you know, and so I went in 2010 to try to get off of opiates, and 4 years later, I'm not only on Suboxone, but I'm on 5 different other medications. And there'd be times where he would write the prescription for a higher dosage, and of course I didn't say anything, you know, because I wanted to feel the effects. And, you know, I can't sit here and say that I didn't abuse any of the medications. I didn't take them as directed. I did. And because, again, it was my solution to life. I just didn't want to deal with reality and deal with life. I didn't know how. So 4 years later, again, I'm on all these meds. And I had, in June of 2014, I was on my way home from work, and I totaled my vehicle under the influence. I was arrested, and basically a slap on the wrist. You know, we'll see you in court in a few months. And at that point, I knew that something, again, needed to change. There was, you know, I wanted something and more for my life. I just didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to get there. And so the powerlessness of this disease had me in its grips, honestly. And the next day, I was right back at it. I was doing the same exact thing, living in a vicious cycle in my head every day of I want to quit, I don't know how. I want to quit, I don't know how. I don't have another solution. And 3 months later, I was arrested again for a DUI under the influence and taken to jail. This time, they weren't quite as lenient with me. I was still pending the first charge, and you know, what I thought at the time was the worst thing that could ever happen to me was actually the best thing that could have ever happened to me, and I look at it as a gift today. And I sat in there for 8 days, and I did a lot of thinking, a lot of contemplating, and again, you know, it was suggested, or somebody had said in there that they were going to go to church while in jail, so I went. And I grew up going to church, definitely steered very far away from it throughout my addiction. And while I was in this little room, these little old ladies just come into the jail and kind of give a little pamphlet and stuff. And I had a spiritual experience in there that day. And for me, the obsession to use was kind of lifted. And I knew that I had an opportunity to do something different. And I wanted to do something different. I was willing to do something different. And so I did. It was suggested of me to join a 12-step program and a 12-step fellowship. And the day that I got out, I did that. And, you know, I dove into the program. And I took suggestions that was offered to me because I didn't know what I was doing. I was clueless. And to deal with life, and I've learned in 3.5 years, you know, how to live life and be a productive member of society. I mean, I'm here right now, you know, and that's just a gift. And I get to work in recovery. I'm director of operations at Recovery Care Partner, and I have a purpose today and I have a passion today, you know, and I get to use my journey of recovery and my road to recovery, you know, and be a voice to others, you know, and give back, and hopefully save some of these lives, you know, and it might be a small piece or a small voice, you know, but anything that I can do, you know, is like I said, it's a gift. My life is a gift today, you know, and I want to continue on my journey, my road to recovery, the work that we do, and just give back as much as I can to know that it wasn't for nothing. You know, my journey was not for, there's a purpose to it, and So that's why I'm here today, and again, I thank you, and I'm honored, so.
Well, thank you for sharing your story with us. Ms. Dar Pino, you're recognized.
Good morning. There we go. Sorry about that. Good morning, Chairman Walden, Chairman Burgess, and distinguished members. Thank you for inviting us here today. My name is Amy Dar Pino, and I just wanted to take a minute to talk to you about my son. Tomorrow, on April 20th, it will be 2 years that I've lost my son, Emmett Scannell, to a heroin overdose. To say these past 2 years have been hard is an understatement. But what's even harder is looking back at the 18 months leading up to his fatal overdose and seeing all of the missed opportunities for intervention and the obstacles to his recovery that he and my family encountered. But before I delve into that, I just wanted to take a minute to tell you about my son, share a picture of him. Emmett was 20 years old. He was a sophomore in college. He was a computer science major attending Worcester State University on a full academic scholarship. Right up until the end, he was on the dean's list somehow. Emmett loved BMX bikes. He had recently started building his own computers. He was an amazing big brother to his siblings, Zachary and Alice. He was handsome, charming, outgoing, incredibly intelligent, and really excited to make his mark on the world. Now, don't get me wrong, my son was not perfect. He was definitely more Eddie Haskell than Wally Cleaver. But it was that zest for life and that excitement that made him who he was and just made him this amazing light in our world until heroin took that away from us. When Emmett was a sophomore in high school, his father and I found out that he had been experimenting with marijuana and with a synthetic substance called K2 or spice. Eager to intervene and set him back on the correct path, his father and I encouraged him to participate in a 12-step program and made certain that he got connected in the recovery community. The 2 years that followed that were amazing. Emmett stayed very active in his recovery community. He excelled academically. He got involved in school, was inducted into the National Honor Society, and fell in love with an amazing young woman. Life was really, really good for those 2 years. And then in 2014, Emmett left for college. And when he left, his biggest concern was the long-distance relationship with his high school sweetheart and worrying how much his mom was going to embarrass him at move-in day with all my tears. But within 6 weeks of beginning school, and that lack of recovery support on campus because his college did not offer any supports, Emmett began experimenting with drugs again. And it's our understanding that it was shortly thereafter that he was introduced to heroin at a party, and that was just the beginning of the end. That fall, we unexpectedly received an ambulance bill in the mail. Little did we know up until that point that our son had been taken out of his college dorm room by paramedics and transferred to a local hospital due to an overdose. After all, he was 18, he was an adult. The FERPA rules at college prohibited them from letting us know what was going on, and a misinterpretation of the HIPAA rules prevented the emergency personnel from notifying us that he had been admitted. When we confronted him about the bill, Emmett told us that the trip to the hospital was simply because he had passed out in his dorm room and hit his head. He was embarrassed, he was stressed out, he was overtired. He didn't want to tell us. Naively, we believed him, because certainly if it had been something worse, like an overdose, someone would have told us, right? So over the next few months, we gradually learned about Emmett's heroin use disorder, and we tried tirelessly to intervene, although there was very little we could do to an 18-year-old that didn't live under our roof. When we finally got him to agree to enter a detox in April of 2015, we thought we were seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. After completing 5 days of detox, the center recommended that we place Emmett in a 30-day treatment program. Unfortunately, our insurance company didn't agree with that. In their eyes, Emmett hadn't failed at detox, is what they told us. And therefore, it was not a necessity that he receive further inpatient treatment. This was followed by yet another detox stint, an intensive outpatient therapy program that unfortunately led to more drug connections than solutions, mismanaged MAT. I can only imagine what life would look like today if appropriate treatment had been received and or medically assisted treatment had been administered according to guidelines. To make matters worse, after Emmett's fatal overdose on April 20th, 2016, We found out that he had been seen at the same hospital and revived with Narcan at least 7 times over the previous year. That's 7 missed opportunities to save this young man's life, simply because of a misinterpretation of HIPAA. The healthcare providers were permitted disclosures during that health emergency, and they didn't reach out to either his primary care physician or to his family. I still carry around my phone that has a 2-year-old voicemail on it, and that voicemail is from the hospital telling us that we needed to call and that Emmett was in trouble. I knew immediately what had happened because I'd never received a call before. And again, I can't imagine how different life would be right now if that voicemail was saying, we have the opportunity to intervene and save this young man's life. Come up and we'll set up a plan. Come up and we'll look for a solution, instead of come up and make arrangements for your son's body. Thank you very much for your time today and for having us here.
We thank you for your testimony. Mr. Gray, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished members, and all in attendance, we, the victims of the epidemic, thank you for this opportunity to bring our painful stories to light for the good of our neighbors. Before I begin, let me offer my deepest condolences to my fellow victims here today. May God be with you as you bravely honor the struggle in memory of your loved one. On January 11th of 2018 at 6:19 p.m., we got the call every parent dreads, the call from whence one never returns to normalcy. We were informed that our daughter Amanda had passed away. Later, it would strike me as an odd phrase for a brilliant, beautiful sorority girl of 24. Passed away seems more like something that happens to a 90-year-old. It's also odd to use this phrase because she was killed, sold something other than what she intended to buy and which the seller knew was fatal. Yet the killer remains free because the investigation of such murders is often treated like a hit-and-run fender bender. Her dealer's likely under a drug court diversion anyway, so she mightn't see any significant penalty even if she were arrested. The opioid heroin problem has been with us a long time and will continue to plague society for a long time to come. However, the combination of heavy stresses on our young people, the increasing potency of heroin, and most importantly, decades of irresponsible overprescribing of opioids for often non-acute pain have conspired to raise to epidemic levels the base problem of substance use disorder and overdose. The introduction of something with the literally uncontrollable potency of fentanyl was a spark to the tinderbox, which is manifest in a public health crisis of catastrophic proportion. Here, I state the obvious, so I'll move on. I'm here representing an under-considered dimension of the opioid crisis, which needs to be considered, since the solutions required are different than the solutions typically discussed. I'm referring to the problem of the intermittent user, coupled with the introduction of fentanyl into the supply stream. This includes the mentally ill, who use the drug for symptom relief, and those using recreationally or experimentally, such as those who try street opioids once or twice just to see what it's all about. These people are right in the crosshairs of the fentanyl scourge. These users have been with us a long time as well. However, depending on their specific biology and relative tendency toward addiction, many would have used some and moved on. Today, they're dying because fentanyl turns every instance of opioid use into a Russian roulette with 4 bullets and 2 blanks. I've heard anecdotal evidence of highly placed ER physicians that a significant portion of the hockey stick increase of the 2016 overdose curve are first, second, or third-time users. My daughter Amanda was somewhere short of her 15th time in her life using heroin when she was killed by pure fentanyl. Moreover, her lack of addiction was, counterintuitively, a contributor to her death. An intermittent user, she had neither the resistance to fentanyl exposure nor the experience to know that she was ingesting pure fentanyl that fateful morning. Amanda suffered from acute borderline personality disorder, a mental illness which is relatively resistant to medical intervention. Alas, there's always one drug that works, the magic but deadly bean called opioid. When experiencing her most intense episodes, Amanda self-medicated, first with benzodiazepine and later with heroin, for relieving her most intense pain. When she first asked us for help because she was abusing Xanax, she explained that she just, quote, had to stop her brain, unquote. In August of 2017, she turned to us for help once again. After 5 years of intensifying symptoms, she now turned to opioids, which eventually killed her. In the 5 months from her first use of heroin to her death from fentanyl, we estimate she used a total of 10 to 12 days, never more than 2 or 3 consecutively. We know this because she spent the vast majority of this period in treatment or psychiatric facilities with no access to illicit drugs. We've been involved in the world of mental illness for several years and substance abuse for a good portion of that. In that time, we've observed that nearly all solutions to the drug problem focus on the singular pattern of addiction, intervention, treatment, and aftercare. While this is an inadequately limited response, it is the result of two very positive trends in our modern attitude toward the problem. First, the stigma of mental illness and drug addiction is moving in a positive direction, albeit far too slowly. Neither is a moral or character failure. Both are diseases, and we're thankfully moving toward an understanding of that fact. Moreover, government and law enforcement officials have matured in their attitude as well. I heard both our county DA and our superintendent of police state last week that, quote, "We can't arrest our way out of this problem," unquote. Both are committed to intervention, outreach, and treatment. This is to be applauded. What needs to mature, however, is our simplistic belief that all users of opioids are one species. In the meeting where our DA and top cop displayed such a good understanding of the best solutions, the 2-hour public meeting went for 1 hour and 50 minutes before anyone, and that was me, mentioned the acutely mentally ill and their search for symptom relief. With tens of thousands of deaths from fentanyl poisoning, a large portion of these are going to be these poor souls or otherwise healthy kids with nothing more than a high-risk attraction profile or a poor impulse control. I think it is wonderful and likely attributable to Sam Quinones and his cogent analysis titled Dreamland that many in public policy are recognizing the responsibility we all have in the overuse of opioids and the migration of illicit opioids to the suburbs. Maybe this recognition is what led us to an attitude of treatment. In any case, this attitude is very positive. But what about the mentally ill? What about the disgraceful way we've let them down? My most passionate advocacy is for these suffering souls so immorally forgotten by society. While they were once forgotten in facilities that cared for their temporal needs, they're now simply forgotten and left in the streets or with their bewildered families. During an intense psychotic episode where my daughter was forcibly committed, we were asked if we would rather handle her at home. Seriously? I might as well have been asked to bring home a Bengal tiger. With nowhere else to turn, the acutely mentally ill find opioids to stop their brain. And thanks to fentanyl, many die soon enough. I'm not here to chastise anyone for a failure of the mentally ill. This is a fight for another day. But yes, we should all be ashamed of how we're leaving them so badly exposed to this epidemic. Today, I'm here to open your minds to one dimension of the opioid crisis, maybe the most solvable one. Is there any way to get this fentanyl genie back in the bottle? Maybe. We need to consider 3 specific solutions for the fentanyl crisis as it relates to the killing of the intermittent user. First, we must recognize organic mental illness as something separate from the generally unhealthy psychological condition of most people who've used opioids to the point of addiction. If we can only find a way to divert such mental illness from the main population of drug addiction, we could see a good reduction in death. Many of these will not have strong addiction tendencies and could find avoidance of serious drugs possible if their illness is recognized and treated early on. Those who are addicted need medically assisted treatment until their acute mental illness is controlled enough to allow them to deal with their addiction. To do this, we first need to educate ourselves past the simplistic idea that all drug addicts are mentally ill and all mentally ill who use drugs are addicts who should be treated with standard addiction intervention. Yet the recovery industry is structured to exactly that principle. If I could remove the phrases co-occurring diagnosis and dual-track treatment from the lexicon of the recovery industry, I would do the world a favor and save some mentally ill victims from a sad demise. The many facilities which claim such capacity are overpromising and putting people at risk. Do we even know the extent of the problem? Do we really understand the line between the anxiety, depression, or PTSD, which plagues virtually all addicts, and congenital brain dysfunction, mental illness? We must recognize and account for this distinction. Outreach is another critical element for this dimension of the problem. One challenge of addiction is that once addiction has gotten hold of the victim, there's little can be done about self-control. The addiction is too powerful. However, if we can get to those who are using intermittently with the message that fentanyl makes occasional opioid use deadly, they just might have the faculties to avoid that terrible decision. In other words, maybe outreach can be very effective in this population. We also need to educate parents to the specific threat to their families. At a local event recently, I saw 2 incredibly brave women present their heart-wrenching stories of the crisis. One described her son's fatal overdose, while the other described her brother's 4 naloxone reversals, one of which left him with some brain damage. As these women presented to a group of parents from my upper middle class town, I observed compassion and a refreshing lack of judgment. To be truly effective, however, we need to get all the way to full empathy, a recognition that this could be me. These parents of today's young people were likely raised with such revulsion to the word heroin that it just doesn't seem real. Many I've spoken to remain unaware of the democratizing fact that heroin is often snorted, not injected. It leads one to wonder, are there still people holding on to the Hollywood image of heroin as the spoon over a candle and the rubber band around the arm, all happening in some dirty alley? I believe that these parents may feel the crisis is closer to home if they are exposed to more than just one, the danger of addiction. If they were to realize that their mentally ill child could self-medicate themselves to death, and their honor student could die with some experimentation at a party, they might come closer to true empathy and therefore vigilance. Not all deaths will be preceded by addiction behavior. So, no matter what level of expertise parents develop in detecting the pattern, they may get the call we did and wonder why they never saw the signs. Maybe there weren't any because the victim wasn't an addict. Maybe the victim was what I've heard referred to as a one and done. What a ghastly phrase. The we can't arrest our way out of this problem philosophy has led to a positive shift toward treatment intervention and away from supply-side solutions. In fact, mandatory minimum laws are quite out of favor. But fentanyl threatens those not necessarily addicted and thus outside the reach of common demand-side solutions. This necessitates that we revisit our thinking. I'll be urging your colleagues on the judiciary to look at targeted enforcement actions for anyone dealing fentanyl. This starts with your support of DEA and CITSA and funding of technologies for safe detection at the street level. As it stands now, the decision to sell fentanyl by a drug dealer is all upside. It's a no-brainer. In fact, one wonders why anyone is still selling heroin at all, since fentanyl has a street value more than 25 times that of heroin. Moreover, thanks to the increased strength of fentanyl, it's easier to procure and to distribute the same material required for the same number of analgesic doses. So short of action on the part of good people, this trend will continue until it's all fentanyl and the numbers become an existential threat to the country. What if every opioid pill sold on the street was just a locally pressed tablet of fentanyl? That vectors the problem to a whole new population, those who are addicted to opioids but don't cross the heroin line. This is a significant group. Finally, I must give a shout out to our Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, for his great contribution to the conversation. His comparison of naloxone training to the Heimlich maneuver and CPR as social responsibility is exactly the kind of recognition we need. We also need to remove the stigma from medically assisted treatment programs. All of you know your former colleague, Mr. Patrick Kennedy, and his inspiring story of personal fortitude. Let's remember that there are many being saved as we speak without his level of notoriety. Yet medically assisted treatment is a hurdle of stigma we have yet to clear. Just last week, I saw some appalling, not in my backyard comments in my hometown about the opening of a treatment center. I thank you for your time and your effort in organizing this roundtable event. Of course, this is a nonpartisan issue. The lines of good and evil are clearly drawn, and there are no gray partisan areas for ideology. I pray that the enthusiasm continue. 64,000 deaths per year is simply unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Ms. Daniels are recognized, please.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Daniels. This is my son, Jamie. December 7, 2016 will forever be the most difficult day for all of us. This was the day we found out our beautiful son, Jamie, had died. Jamie was 23. Rumors surrounding his death circulated throughout our community, but Jamie's story is not what anyone expected. There was no predisposition to addiction in our family, and honestly, I didn't know how to recognize the signs. I do know that at times throughout Jamie's life, he'd feel like he didn't fit in, or would go to the extreme to fit in, as was the case in university. When Jamie was 16, he gave a self-diagnosis to a therapist as having ADD and asked for Adderall. After seeing the therapist for several weeks, the therapist agreed with him and told me I had set him up to fail, that he wasn't smart enough to get through high school, let alone get into university. I was dumbfounded, almost speechless. Maybe it was adolescent behavior, stress, or anxiety, but it absolutely was not ADD. Years after his diagnosis, and after graduating university, Jamie admitted to me he intentionally answered the questions wrong on the ADD test. It was that easy. After that, Jamie gave us no reason to suspect he was using or abusing drugs. He graduated high school with no issue and went on to university while he was still taking Adderall. In January 2015, just 4 months prior to Jamie's graduation from Michigan State University, we found out he had been abusing prescription medication. We don't know exactly when he turned to opioids, but we do know they were easily obtainable on campus, and by the time he graduated, he couldn't stop. I got a referral to yet another therapist near Jamie's school who told me not to worry, he'd be fine. He passed Jamie off to another therapist who continued to get Jamie his Adderall. With Jamie being over 18, he was now able to find his own therapist. He found a psychiatrist that several of his friends went to, whose office was about an hour away from school, and who only saw Jamie a minimal amount of time and continued to prescribe Jamie Adderall. Jamie graduated Michigan State University with a 3.5 GPA in May of 2015. He had arranged a summer job that he started in June. By early July, he was in serious trouble. In an attempt to detox himself, Jamie called and begged for help. We found him a rehab facility in Michigan, and he signed himself in. Since they felt he had already detoxed himself, he was admitted for 2 weeks for therapy. He seemed to do okay. When I went to pick him up, I asked his therapist at the facility for recommendations for therapists to continue treatment. The answer? The person who has that information was off. Call her tomorrow. When I called to speak to the woman the next day, she told me to Google it. At the same time, we had Jamie call the psychiatrist he had been seeing before he went to rehab and tell him that he was an addict. I had a difficult time finding a therapist, and Jamie told us he felt most comfortable with the psychiatrist he had been seeing, so we agreed to let him go back, knowing that Jamie had admitted that he was addicted to pills. We came to find out that the Adderall continued to be prescribed, along with sleeping pills. Jamie relapsed 2 weeks later. I watched him try to detox himself several times. On 3 occasions, I took him to the emergency room during an acute crisis, only to be discharged hours later with no long-term plan. We finally found help from a psychologist in Michigan who, at Jamie's lowest point, recommended he move to an inpatient treatment center in Florida. After spending 10 days in the hospital in Michigan going through detox, where they weaned him off all the medication he was taking, less than 24 hours later, Jamie was on a plane to Florida. The plan that was arranged for Jamie by the psychologist, the admissions advisor at the treatment center, Jamie, and myself, was to spend a few weeks at the inpatient treatment center and then move to a sober living home. With guidance, he'd attend outpatient treatment meetings, be routinely drug tested, and expected to find a job and acclimate himself back into society, clean and sober. Jamie was in Florida for 7 months. We had high hopes of his being a success story of sobriety, but it wasn't to be. We had no clue about the corruption in Florida. No one said anything to us. When I was on the phone with Jamie and his therapist in Florida, we spoke about him moving into a sober home. Not once did the therapist mention anything about what had been going on in Florida. It took us almost 8 months after Jamie died to put the pieces together. With the help of the Florida State Attorney and his Special Drug Task Force detectives, we have now learned that what has become a billion-dollar broken recovery industry often includes corruption and criminal activity and took Jamie's life. Florida has become the recovery capital with over 400 sober living homes in Palm Beach County alone. These homes are linked with outpatient treatment programs, doctors, and labs. However, many sober home owners realized there was more money to be made preying on individuals with insurance. They pay anywhere from $500 to $1,000 to what have been termed body brokers. These people befriend and lure individuals into specific sober homes with offers of gifts, or as in Jamie's case, a promise of rent completely covered by insurance. In many cases, drugs are easily accessible to those in recovery, so the relapsed client has to enter detox again and the cycle starts all over. All the while, the owners are charging the insurance. In a nutshell, it is patient brokering. They receive kickbacks for each patient they refer, and they can keep billing the insurance. With Jamie, The doctor they sent him to, a self-described addiction specialist, put Jamie on new medication for his anxiety. Jamie had already been on an anti-anxiety medication for a month. This new doctor prescribed alprazolam, commonly known as Xanax, a highly addictive drug and not one that would commonly be prescribed to someone addicted to prescription medication. In other words, Jamie was set up to fail. On December 7th, just 4 days after being prescribed these medications, Jamie ingested heroin laced with fentanyl. Since Jamie had been clean for 7 months, that pill shocked his heart and eventually killed him. Unfortunately, it wasn't clear to police at the time, nor to us now, how or where Jamie got the drugs, as no drugs nor any of Jamie's medications were found at the scene. What we do know is the house manager never gave Jamie Narcan that could have potentially saved his life. There has also been a question as to how long Jamie's roommate and the house manager waited before calling 911. Shortly after returning from the cemetery after Jamie's funeral, we started receiving a series of text messages from Jamie's roommate from the last house he lived in. In addition to telling us he had some of Jamie's possessions that he'd return if we sent him money, he told us he had enough information on the house they were living in to bury the owners under the house. The intent, of course, was not to kill Jamie, but to keep him in the system and continue to abuse his insurance. After speaking with Blue Cross Fraud Department and the Drug Task Force detectives, it was determined that charges from 2 of the 3 sober homes Jamie had lived in were fraudulent. In less than 7 months, there was upwards of $60,000 in insurance charges for urine and blood tests alone. Recently, a report was made of drug screens being sent to a rural hospital rather than city labs, as insurance companies pay out more to keep money in the rural areas. Specifically, a hospital in rural Georgia is under investigation for fraud after being recently purchased by someone in Florida. After looking at Jamie's EOBs again, we found lab screens that were sent from Florida to this hospital and paid out by Blue Cross Blue Shield. It turns out that the doctor he was sent to after moving into his second sober house has been on the FBI's radar since at least 2013. Working with Blue Cross Fraud, we found 3 requisitions signed by the doctor were done during a week of Thanksgiving 2016, when we were able to show proof that Jamie was home with us in Michigan and not in the state of Florida. We were told we had no recourse with either doctor. Because there is no standard of care, I was told if we went to court, it was my expert witnesses against the doctors. So Jamie's cause of death remains accidental death by overdose. Addiction has become one of the most lucrative businesses in our country. We know how some doctors, labs, sober homes, and treatment centers are defrauding the insurance, but we haven't stopped it. We know that anyone can open a sober home, and there may be little to no oversight. There should be certification necessary to open and operate a sober home with regular inspections of condition of the home, and to make sure that there is Narcan readily accessible, and it should be required by all homeowners and house managers that they be certified to administer Narcan with serious consequences for failure. We know that for many, treatment is unaffordable. We know that even with treatment, the relapse rate far outweighs the success rate, but we haven't worked hard enough to change it. There have to be standard of care practices put in place immediately. We are allowing predators to continue nefarious practices, and it has to stop now. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share Jamie's story with you. My hope is that the efforts and caring of this committee, the committee of our legislatures, will help lead to desperately needed and long overdue development and oversight of addiction treatment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Daniels. Thank you for sharing your story with us. I would point out the investigation of sober homes was conducted by the Subcommittee of Oversight and Investigations, not our subcommittee, but that has been part of our evaluation of this problem. And Ms. Smith, you're recognized.
It's an honor to be here this morning, and I thank you for that opportunity. The topic being presented is one that's very close to my heart. My name is Gayle Smith. Is this on? Gayle Smith, and
Again, we are the premier technology committee in the United States House of Representatives, and we can turn on a microphone. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, we're the Health Subcommittee. We're not the
my name
telecom.
is Gayle Smith, and I've
Mike.
Okay, good. Thank you.
That's a
All right,
great
good
way
deal.
to call attention
Yeah,
to
much
yourself,
better.
huh? All right, so good morning, all. It's an honor to be here this morning. Thank you for the opportunity. The topic being presented is one that's close to my heart. My name is Gayle Smith, and I've been invited here to share from personal experience how the opioid crisis has affected my family and why I, my family, and friends are so very passionate about change. I think it'll be helpful for you to know just a little bit about our background. I live in Mount Laurel, New Jersey of Burlington County for the last 18 years. It's a nice town with good schools and good community. I've been married 28 years to my husband, Chris, and we have 2 children, Jessica and Kenny. While my children were young, I was a stay-at-home mom. During that time, I finished my master's degree and became a professional counselor. As a family, we enjoyed time together. We went on vacation, celebrated holidays, birthdays. We attended church and practiced our faith. We taught our kids to be good citizens who respect themselves and others. We taught them to be active in school, sports, hobbies, and we taught them about God. In 2010, Kenny was a freshman playing high school football when he was abusively bullied by a coach. Kenny's drive for school and extracurricular activities faded away, and his curiosity with alcohol and marijuana began. From 2010 to 2016, Kenny's curiosity morphed into a full-fledged heroin addiction. 6 years is a long time to watch your sweet hazel-eyed boy become a different person. During that time, my husband and I did everything we could to get Kenny to the point he was willing to accept help. That time finally arrived in May of 2016. Kenny decided to leave for treatment the day after Mother's Day. And I thought, what could be a better Mother's Day gift? My son is going to get the help he needs. I'm going to get my son back. My husband is going to get his little buddy back. And his sister, get the brother back she adores. Little did I know, it was going to be the last time we saw Kenny alive. At the time, we had good insurance, and since Kenny was 20 years old, he was still covered by it. I did some research and had him approved at a reputable treatment facility called Palm Partners in Delray Beach, Florida, where Kenny detoxed and spent a few days in residential treatment. However, he relapsed and was moved to another treatment facility, and the pattern of being shuffled around and moved to different facilities continued until his death. During the 4 months that Kenny was in Florida for treatment, he was in 6 different treatment centers. The last one was the Millennium Treatment Group in Lake Worth, Florida. We now know that this treatment group practiced patient brokering. Kenny ended up in one of Bradley Vercosa's sober living homes. Vercosa was recently arrested for patient brokering. It was in this one house that Kenny died from a mix of heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil, just 3 weeks after his 21st birthday on August 16, 2016. Kenny got trapped in the web of treatment center sober living scam. We are devastated by the loss of our precious Kenny. We're angry at the unscrupulous and criminal behaviors of the individuals that prey on vulnerable people. We are frustrated that we were not privy by HIPAA laws to know where our son was being placed for treatment. That needs to change. My son was young enough to be covered under his parents' insurance and supposedly old enough to navigate his own treatment all alone. This is wrong on so many levels, but it's especially wrong for young person in addiction treatment. We have evidence the brain is not fully developed until an individual reaches 25 years old. Now consider that coupled with a brain not fully developed with substance abuse. I can imagine that this individual would need help making reasonable, rational decisions about their treatment. I believe that Kenny most definitely needed that help. The web that Kenny got trapped in just told him what to do and to sign, and he did that. We only would learn that he had been transferred to the next center when he had a working cell phone and an opportunity to call us. That's a broken process. We need to change policies that hinder communication to parents. It needs to be that a young person has parents' insurance and is seeking treatment for active addiction. The insurance carrier must be notified and, if willing, involved in the process. Thank you for your time, and I'm willing to answer any questions. At Kenny's funeral, we made a commitment to fight the opioid epidemic, and I'm here today because I'm standing up for Kenny.
Well, thank you, Ms. Smith, and thanks to all of our panelists. It's certainly been a very informative morning. Our last two witnesses have really pointed out how important it is. We can do as much harm if we get it wrong as the people who are perpetrating the crisis in the first place. So we do need to be careful about our legislative direction, and I think this panel this morning has provided us a lot of stuff to consider, a lot of stuff that we'll need to take into account as we consider the significant number of bills that are ahead of us. So Keith, again, I want to welcome you and thank you for coming up here. We live in a similar part of the world. Denton County, Texas, we're probably 430 miles from the Mexican border, but I think there is ample evidence in our communities that we are still impacted by some of the things that come over the border illicitly, and that's been a focus and one that we need to continue. Let me recognize Mr. Green for questions he might have for the panel.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I don't have questions because we serve on the Health Subcommittee and we watched this over the years, and I know my colleagues on the committee have heard my stories when I was a practicing lawyer in Houston, Texas in the 1980s. I did mental health work and chemical dependency through the court system. And the sad part is today we have less beds in Houston, Harris County for treatment. Although, Ms. Smith, your situation you were taken advantage of by people who we depend on helping. And I know we have a package of legislation, but I'm hoping each of those bills would respond to some of the problems you have. But mostly it's some place to go. I know the issues on HIPAA, and to some of us HIPAA is almost sacred. But I also know that a child, even if they're an adult, I know doctors don't like it, but privacy folks do. But there are ways that you can have your child to give you permission to do it. And I've had the same problem with relatives that weren't mentally ill, but the doctor just wouldn't share information with us. And but there's a way you can deal with it. So I don't, like I said, we consider it sacred, but if there is a way we can deal with HIPAA that would be reasonable. And so that's another issue we need to do. But y'all bring up so many cases, that's why I guess we have a huge package of pieces of legislation. But as my chairman will hear, Medicaid is our predominant payer for mental health and chemical dependency. And you take out the jails, state prisons, and we need to deal with Medicaid to make sure they have the resources there to take care of someone who doesn't have an insurance policy. And I have an urban district, and in my case, that's typically the reason. Mr. Mandel?
I'd just like to make a comment. There's a lot of bills here to be considered. And I believe I speak for everyone on this side of the room that we've shared our stories for a purpose, not to look backward, because we all care about preventing this from happening to others. And I feel certain, it's a fact, that members of Congress are very smart people. I don't think there's any question about that. And I ask a couple questions. Number one, so less people become addicted. Will members of Congress be able to create a way, whether it's regulation, incentivizing payments, some other method, in the next 60 days that can be implemented by the end of the year, that every doctor in the country who prescribes opioids is following the CDC guideline, which again, it's not my guideline, it's not anybody else's here guideline. This is the CDC of the United States. That's number one. Number two, I think you've heard consistently, there's programs out there that work. Can members of Congress in the next 60 to 90 days to be implemented by the end of the year find a way through regulation, incentivizing payments, whatever, that all treatment that's still delivered is evidence-based? Can we find a way to define what evidence-based is in a way it's not going to be perfect to start, but it's a heck of a lot better than all this money that the government's giving out going to states not being used for programs that are following old beliefs versus what we know today works. And those first two things I mentioned, 1 and 2, do not cost any money. And the reason why I raise this, when you mentioned Medicaid, this will save Medicaid billions and billions of dollars to do those two things. Save billions of dollars.
Well, I do, I'm going to, the gentleman Texas will yield.
I'll be glad to yield.
Sure.
We,
CDC
we don't have an interpreter to talk to each other.
The CDC guidelines, and I appreciate you bringing them up. I will tell you, we have heard from stakeholders who are concerned about the CDC guidelines. People who have chronic conditions who've been maintained, who worry about the rapid tapering that could occur under CDC guidelines. So I get it. There's a continuum here, right. And I think the goal should be, what do we do, as you all say, what do we do going forward? Okay, we've got people who are in the treatment protocol now. It's not our job to try to force them into something else that may comport with our beliefs, but how do we going forward? So the goals that you talk about are reasonable ones, but I will just tell you, it's not, we have heard from stakeholders who do have different opinions. So please, when you watch the markup next week, if it doesn't comport exactly with what you've requested, we are trying to consider a variety of opinions. But I will also tell you, and I have never seen on almost anything else, the cooperation between the agencies, the administrative and legislative branch. We had a roundtable yesterday with Kellyanne Conway from the White House and several members of DHS and HHS. There is a broad commitment to, getting this right. And we recognize we're not going to get it right the first time, but we will continue to work on it. And you have brought home today how desperately important it is that, that we do. I'll recognize the chairman of the full committee.
And again, I want to thank each and every one of you and express our deep condolences and sympathies for what you're struggling with. The hardest thing a parent can go through is the loss of a child. I want to make 3 points, and then I've got a question or two. One is you've raised the issue of patient brokering. We've talked about pill dumping and distributors. On, I think it's May 8th, this committee, this subcommittee, will have before it the CEOs of the major distribution companies. The other subcommittee, Oversight Investigations, for more than a year has been doing its work behind the scenes in a deep dive investigation focused principally on what went wrong in West Virginia, because there are court cases and allows you to dig deeper quicker. We're looking at pill dumping. I think it was Kermit, West Virginia, population 392, had millions of pills dropped in a matter of a couple of years. We have had to threaten the DEA with subpoena to get documents from them. On at least 2 occasions I've had to do that, and to get them to be more forthcoming with what's gone on in their enforcement or lack thereof. Patient brokering is something we have been investigating. Obviously, we're not an arm of the law necessarily. You've been pursuing that through legal means. But we want to know from a public policy standpoint what went wrong there, what's going on there, how do we stop that? And so we are pursuing that, and of course the pill dumping. The issue of HIPAA has been raised in 42 CFR Part 2. That legislation is one of the bills under consideration. I would tell you it is probably in the top 5 most controversial bills under consideration in the committee, maybe the #1 most controversial. People have very strongly held views on that. And I'd like, just if you could, to give us why changing that is important, if you're familiar with it, and and what we should do and think about. Again, these mics, if the trick I was an old radio guy, the trick is just hold it down once.
I think I have it.
You do. And the closer you bring it, the more people will be able to hear.
Perfect. I'm fairly loud without it, but I would love to speak to that for a moment, both simply as a parent, in knowing that my son essentially died and was brought back to life.
Mm-hmm.
And there was nobody with him following that. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to think that he was alone in a hospital room, because we know that he had been just dropped off at the hospital because nobody wants to be associated with, they're afraid of getting in trouble. His friends didn't stay with him. To think that he was alone in that moment is devastating. Devastating to me, to think that I could have been there for him. Mm-hmm. I'm a mom. I want to fix everything. I want to fix a splinter. But just in general, offering a plethora of strategies in that moment, whether it's counseling, induction to MAT, inpatient treatment, family supports, peer recovery services, quickly following an overdose is essential. It's so important that we take that opportunity to intervene quickly and to act with compassion. And we can't do that if we're not notified.
Mr. Mandel?
Sure. I would suspect that most of the opposition, from what I've heard, is it's actually smart and good opposition, which is it's not special interest, it's not money motivated, it's well-intentioned, which is if information about a patient who has either mental health or addiction issues is a little bit more available, then people will lose jobs, people will be stigmatized, et cetera. That's the opposition, and that is legitimate, and it's fair, and it's not motivated by money. But the solution is not to keep this information out of electronic health records and keep this information not available, or keep parents from being in the hospital room when something happens to their son or daughter. The solution is to end the stigma.
Mm-hmm.
And to bring this disease and mental health into the healthcare system, just like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, or any other disease. That's the solution. That's what we're recommending. That's what the bill recommends. Mm-hmm. And if there's an issue related to unintended consequences of someone not getting a job, let's fix that.
Mm-hmm.
But let's not keep this out of the healthcare system, just like diabetes, heart disease, or cancer, because then we just perpetuate the situation that is causing it in the first place.
Mr. Gray?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think there's another thing I'd like to mention. In my daughter's specific case, she was in a psychiatric facility where she got very good care, and things were going pretty well. The process ran its course, and she had to be put out of that hospital. It's a whole other question we have on the mental health care. But when she was transitioned to the what we call PHP, partial hospitalization, which precedes the IOP, again, because we weren't part of that process, she was actually put into something that was probably counterproductive for her recovery, and ultimately.
And again, you weren't part of that process because?
Excuse me?
Why were you not part of that process?
Because of HIPAA laws, because she was over 18 years old. That's my point. Yeah. So we weren't in that conversation. We got snippets of the conversation, but there's something else I'd like to bring to light specific about HIPAA with regards to us here. When you're talking about substance abuse and mental health, you've got this additional problem where you've got the patient is usually a pretty tough person to deal with. So what you get is not only are we not in the conversation because of HIPAA, we are on the periphery of the conversation being subjected to the manipulation and the lies and everything else that goes on. So you get this crazy version of what's going on. And so we were led down the primrose path to put my daughter back into a pretty loose rehab facility from whence she left and started using and died. So I think that's another dimension to the HIPAA. In this case, you're talking about patients who have really no competency in many cases.
Right.
You know, my daughter was significantly ill, and in a way, a significant illness that led her to be manipulative and half-truthful, and so we didn't really know what was going on. And there's definitely that part of the process where she transitioned from a psychiatric facility back into a rehab at a point when she shouldn't have done that. If we had known that was a rehab, we were told it was a psychiatric hospital, and it wasn't. But we had no access to the records, right? So
Keith?
Here's a perfect example of that. I have a mother that called me one day, and she had gotten a call from her son's landlord indicating that he had overdosed. He had no other information other than he had overdosed. The child was in New Mexico. We were in North Texas. So she called me and she said, Kath, what can I do? He did not release HIPAA for her. So once he got to the hospital, she did not know what hospital he was in or what was his condition. Here's his mother. So what we did was I got on the phone and I called everybody I knew that knew somebody in the Albuquerque area, and we found an advocate from the hospital that could at least give us a little bit of information. All she wanted to know was, is her son alive? That is a breakdown. Parents deserve to know that. Absolutely. And as we talk about HIPAA, one of the things that happened with us is when my son was 14 years old, 13, 14, he went in to get a pediatric checkup. And because he was kind of a big boy, I said, you can just go back by yourself. And he came out, and that evening, the pediatrician called me and said, I just want to let you know that Brett has been experimenting with drugs. And when I said, can you be more specific? She said, no, I can't. And it's because I was not in that room, and yet he was still a minor. So HIPAA is not about an 18-year-old and up. It is about being there. And those things need to kind of be adjusted. You know, if it's an advocacy thing over the HIPAA, fine, but parents deserve to know if their child is dead or alive.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment on that? Not, I would yield to my colleagues if you have questions. Mr. Griffith.
Let me wade into this tough area. I think we need to do something about HIPAA. But as a product of a single-parent household where my father did not participate in my raising, I'm not going to agree 100% that parents deserve to know. Because sometimes, and I don't know what your situation was, Ms. Hott, you indicated you were traumatized, but if that trauma was caused by a family member, then maybe they don't belong in the room. And these are the tough decisions that we have to try to figure out to put into the code of the United States. It's the balancing act. Absolutely, you deserve to know. Absolutely, you all deserve to know. But there are circumstances, and we have to try to figure out how to thread that needle where we're balancing those privacy rights where a patient may actually have a legitimate reason for a parent not to know versus those where the parent has been, like you all, loving and caring and trying to be involved. So this is what makes these issues so tough. Yes, sir.
Just a very quick comment. I would just ask you to, in addition to parents, really be mindful of other professional people in the healthcare system also being able to know. Having it within electronic health records like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, brings it into the healthcare system.
And I do think that's important. And we had a panel before this one earlier today where we were talking about electronic health records with the goal of trying to get it so that everybody can carry it on their phone. And so we're working on all of these issues. We've had a number of hearings. The Florida situation is atrocious. Glad that your folks in Florida are looking into that. We need more treatment facilities around. My district has very few, and it's a fairly large district. So, you know, one of my treatment facilities is literally 4 hours from the other side of the district where there is no treatment facility. Mr. Guthrie's got a bill that we're working on, as you all know. I'm listening to things today I hadn't heard in the same way before, and we may need additional bills, and we know that. The bills that we're going to mark up next week are not the end. Two of you tagged Adderall. This is a concern. Ms. Winnefeld, did I say that close? You indicated that your son had gotten the Adderall by virtue of a misdiagnosis. I assume that was ADHD. Is that correct, or was it some other misdiagnosis?
Could you turn on your microphone? Yeah, sorry.
Starting at age 4, probably, teachers, school counselors always said they misinterpreted his behavior as being attention deficit because he wasn't the one to be first in line. He wasn't the one to raise his hand. He was very quiet and introvert. You know, throughout the years, they would always say he's attention deficit. I took him in, I had him tested. He never presented to those that tested him.
over the years. As a military family, at one point, we moved 5 times in 6 years from the end of grade school going into high school. So my one son saw this as an adventure. My other son, it was, you know, I don't know whose stomach was more upset on the first day of school, mine or his, thinking about the lunchroom and new kids. And he came to me finally and just said, I don't feel right. And I knew by then he had started experimenting with marijuana. I took him in, and the chief psychiatrist at Walter Reed, child psychiatrist, said, your son has attention deficit and he would benefit from Adderall. What the Adderall did, he could be high. He did great on his SATs, hyper-focused him all the way through his junior year, and then he totally crashed. He was a pitcher on his baseball team. He had great grades. He'd gotten in early acceptance into college. But by then, he was so messed up from getting Xanax at school to bring him down. He was doing marijuana, you know, at the beginning of the day to kind of help him just relax and fit in. You know, when we finally got to a really good psychiatrist, he's like, Adderall is the last thing your son should have ever been on. Because, and I even went out to USC and had his brain, he had got a quantitative EEG done on him because I've done a lot of work with our wounded veterans. So I've done a lot of work in PTS and TBI, and his brain waves, he processed faster than a normal, quote, normal person. So the Adderall just, you know, put him on edge, and he tried to take his life, wrapped his car around, thankfully wrapped his car around a telephone pole, and that's when he ended up in a psych ward for 5 days. And that's when, for us, our insurance company didn't understand that my son was suicidal and he had an addiction. So I used the term dual diagnosis because they tried to send us to all different types of treatment centers that were totally incorrect for him. I really needed someone who understood.
And do you think that, and I don't know the answer, did anybody tell you, or do you believe that made him more susceptible to?
Oh, most definitely. Adderall, yes. It's an amphetamine. On the street, it's illegal, and our doctors are prescribing Adderall, Vyvanse, Ritalin, and it makes me ill when I think about kids now at the age of 4 are being put on Adderall. I mean, it's just, it modifies the brain patterns, the brain, and how it sets up.
And Ms. Daniels, you I believe, indicated Adderall was a part of your child's problem as well. It's hard to tell. Talk and see if it works.
Is that?
There, you're on.
Okay. For Jamie, having been given Adderall when it was at a time when mental illness and anxiety, stress, those things weren't talked about with kids. So he had friends that he was in school with that had ADD. Jamie was the most meticulous kid ever. Not one school teacher ever said Jamie had an issue with ADD. He was a very bright kid in school. And when he was put on the Adderall, and I fought the therapist to begin with, I went to his doctor, and I was told, don't worry about it. Lots of kids in university take it before exams. It's okay. It just calms them down before an exam, helps them study. And that was ongoing. And when Jamie went into university the first year and he needed his Adderall prescriptions, I used to show him national news reports that you couldn't get Adderall. The pharmacies couldn't stock it anymore because so many kids were given Adderall, and then it just got to the point where now they drop it in their alcohol. Now it's a weekend thing that they're dropping Adderall and alcohol and drinking. So they know what it does to them, and it's very easy to get. And on campus, all of these drugs are easy to get. There was a woman selling her medication, and these fraternities and sororities had this woman's name on speed dial, and she was selling her prescriptions. They called her grandma, and she was getting her prescriptions from a doctor and off campus, and she would go and feed them to the kids. And the other thing is, it's not just alcohol in the fraternities. Jamie was hazed with drugs. That's how he was, that was the hazing going into this one of the fraternities. And that's what they do. When they go out and tailgate, it's let's snort coke, let's do whatever, take Percocet, Vicodin, you name it. They've got it, and it's readily available, and they're not getting it out of their parents' cabinets anymore. We're giving our old medications away. It's on the dark web. They're sitting at dinner with you, and these kids can text. And I know 12-year-olds that are vaping in school that have been found with these vape pens now. It's running, everything is there. But this Adderall, I do believe, was the catalyst to all of it, because when he couldn't get Adderall, it changed to something else. So, and the other thing is going to a psychiatrist who, most of them now, my personal opinion is that they're pharmacologists. They're not treating. They know that there's enough therapists, social workers, psychologists out there to do the day-to-day. They're giving the prescriptions. I found a pill bottle of 150 Adderall pills because Jamie was up at school and he was an hour away from the psychiatrist. And he knew full well that Jamie had gotten out of rehab, but continued to give it to him. And not one therapist ever questioned, where's the paperwork? I have no paperwork saying that Jamie had ADD or ADHD, but nobody questioned it to the end. And in one other point that I was unable to make was, it's not just in Florida. Looking back, trying to go to treatment, there were medical doctors that I took Jamie to that were helpful. But unless he chose an IOP on their list, it wasn't good enough that we were paying out of pocket for a private therapist for Jamie, a psychologist. They weren't getting the kickback from the IOP or the rehab facility, but this, the psychologist was perfectly willing. Jamie signed off on it. Talk to the doctors as much as you want. We said, Jamie, as many days a week that you want to see this woman, see her. He trusted her. He liked her. She was helping him. They wouldn't accept it, to give him the Suboxone that he needed and continue that treatment. So I kept hitting a wall every time. And it all goes down to big business first. Let's worry about what happens at the end. Oh, we lost you. We'll move on to the next, because coming out of the woodwork.
I think, if you back up, really, you need to look at this again, and what Gary also brought up is the mental health issue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, from early on, my son did not, he was quiet. He wasn't like his brother. We really need to relook how we handle mental health in this country, and how we reimburse for those services. And it can't be the 5-minute quick HMO, or a PPO, get them through. If your brain doesn't function, nothing functions. So it's more important to me than your heart or anything else, and yet we spend millions on billions. Thank you.
In the last Congress, this committee under Chairman Upton's leadership rewrote America's mental health laws for the first time since the first one was signed into law by President Kennedy. And a lot of the program changes we made in the last appropriations bill finally are getting funded. And so we've spent years looking at what works, what doesn't. To your point, Gary, about evidence-based, we spent a lot of time looking at that and tried to get to that point in mental health. Obviously, we need to do that here as well. I'm going to go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, that bill also asked for help from the Secretary to help us try to figure out the HIPAA issue, because we had so much difficulty that we said, okay, we're going to give the experts a shot at it. We still have the authority, but we wanted to get some assistance because we're trying to struggle with that issue.
And I think also, again, coming back to the electronic health records, I am very fortunate that I'm on a board of a large philanthropic effort that's opening up 25 to 30 mental health clinics across the U.S. for veterans and their families. We have an electronic health record. This is being funded with $300 million from one person. So, but we realize the importance, so that when those people move around, those records go with them, so we know what's going on with our clients. Extremely important.
Might go to Mr. Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There, I think. Is that on now or not?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Billy Long, Missouri 7, southwest part of Missouri, heartland of the country. And I do a farm tour every year where we go around and look at different tours in my 7th district of Missouri, 10 and a fraction counties that I represent. And we were driving on our farm tour one day on a bus and looking out over just picturesque Norman Rockwell farms and green grass and trees. And one of the gentlemen on the bus was from that area. And he said the number one problem in our school district here in this idyllic middle of America, 7th District in Missouri, is heroin. I'm 62 years old. Most of my friends are around 62 years old that I grew up with. And in the last 5, 6 years, 3 of those friends have lost children to opioids. And so I want to thank you all for taking the time to come to Washington, D.C. And can you stand your picture up again there? Yeah, I think, and tilt that one towards me a little bit, the camera, I think, can pick it up better. I think people need to see these pictures. Yeah, everyone's got a picture of your child you lost. I think that it's important for people to see these faces and have them looking back at them while we're trying to address this issue and look at everything that goes into it. But like I said, when I was growing up, my parents, I didn't come home one day and my parents say, "Oh my goodness, so-and-so lost a child to drugs." And so this is a scourge on our society. It's, I think Mr. Mandel said, what did you say, 400, was that you that said 400 people a day?
That includes alcohol. Without alcohol.
Alcohol and drugs, 400 people a day get a call that a loved one is lost every day in this country. And I think that's what people don't always focus on or don't always realize is what a widespread problem it is. And there's 435 congressmen. Out of that 435 congressmen, 435 of them will look you in the eye and tell you that their congressional district has the biggest opioid problem in the country. All 435 of us will swear that our area has the biggest problem. So that again tells you what type of problem we're dealing with. Mr. Mandel, I was struck by something you said. Your son Brian had not used in 13 months when he deceased. And can you tell us again, just briefly, why that happened after 13 months of no usage? He took his own life.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for the question. What happened was that he had relapsed and he went to a program. It was his 7th program, and they put him on Suboxone, which was the previous programs had never even mentioned it. I didn't even know the medication existed. They put him on Suboxone, and they called his mother and I and explained why and said he was addicted to opioids. This is the medication that can really help him. So we said, okay, he stayed on it. And then this treatment program did a great job while he was there. But they essentially had an assistant looking through a database to what happens when he leaves there. And they literally had a tough time finding an outpatient program that would accept him on Suboxone. This is 2011, January 2011. They couldn't find, they had a tough time. So they found one out in California that said, we will accept him on the Suboxone and keep him on it. The second day he was there, the first night and the next morning, I get a call from Brian and said, "Dad, you're not gonna believe this. I walked in to the psychiatrist and he said, you have to get off the Suboxone." So I immediately called the director of the program and he said, "Look, I agreed he could stay on it, but I had never checked with the psychiatrist. He doesn't believe in it. He's trading one addiction for another." And I had a big fight with him. I didn't want to move him to another program, so they agreed to let him stay on it for several months. But what they were doing, which I didn't know, was titrating him down from 8 milligrams to 7 to 6 to 5. I didn't know, but I know now, that the recommended dosage is 8 to 20 milligrams. That's in the Surgeon General report. So when he was on 8, taking him to 7, he's essentially off. 6, essentially off. Basically, he was off it. And so they had taken him down to 4 milligrams, and so he was essentially off it. And that's when he went from doing really, really well to start sliding down. He never used. I guess the term I've learned is white knuckling it. And so he was white knuckling it, if you will, not using, but I suspect, starting to really feel the urges. He mentioned suicide 8 different times. When I finally got his records, I had to actually hire an attorney to get the records. When I got his records, I found out that he had mentioned in 8 different occasions over 4 months before he died suicidal thoughts. And no one mentioned it to his parents and I, although Brian had signed a release and we were speaking to them every Tuesday night. No one mentioned it. The 3 therapists that heard the suicidal thoughts never even mentioned it. And what I didn't mention was the day before he died, he was released saying he doesn't need treatment anymore. And then the next morning he woke up and started researching suicide notes and took his life. And that's why I believe of all the things we're considering, they're all important. It's hard to prioritize. The Results Act is critical. Yes, it's not going to be perfect. It's not perfect in all of medicine today. But all of medicine is not reimbursed and it's regulated where doctors have to follow evidence-based treatment. How do you define evidence-based treatment with cancer, heart, when there's new things coming out all the time? It's not perfect. But going from where we are today to treating this like any other disease could have easily mitigated that situation. Could have easily mitigated all of these situations. And again, it's not going to be perfect. But to not pass the Results Act because it's not going to be perfect would be a tragedy beyond anything that I could ever imagine.
Thank you. Ms. Smith, you said something that struck me also, and that is that your son relapsed in a treatment center in Florida, and then I believe you also said they moved him to a total of 6 different treatment centers in Florida. So these drugs are readily available. I just shows you my naivete on it, but these drugs are readily available in these treatment centers. I mean, if he relapsed in the treatment center, was he on a pass and went out to the mall and bought something, or are these drugs available in these treatment centers?
I think the very first time that he relapsed was he was out on pass, and a lot of the drug dealers, from what we're learning now, are just hanging around the treatment centers and kind of preying on the people in recovery. Beyond that, when he relapsed, he was in an IOP and living in a sober house when he did die. So he was using evidently in the sober house and in treatment.
Okay, thank you. And Miss, is it Hot, Miss Hot? You said that you started using at a very young age. Can you define young age when you actually started, and what your first drug, was it alcohol, was it marijuana? What was your first drug experience at that young age, and how young were you?
I would take drinks of alcohol, probably 10 or younger. But
Can you pull your mic a little closer?
Is that better?
Yeah.
I had drinks of alcohol at 10 years of age or younger. Would just try it. You know, it looked like, parents would have it or adults would have it. And I knew that I couldn't have it, but I would try it. Experimenting with drugs. 11, I think, is when I purchased marijuana for the first time and experimented with it. I was about 11 years old.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question of all of you, I guess, but Ms. Winnefeld, you said that you have a problem with politicians saying, just don't start, just don't start. Of course, we had the famous just say no that you or someone else said didn't work. There's a big, it's less and less controversial all the time, but there's a big question in this country whether we should legalize marijuana or not for recreational purposes. Did any of your all's children was that not their gateway drug?
It was for us.
Yeah, I think a lot of people you talk to, marijuana is a gateway drug, and I think, that train has left the station. So I think, again, instead of just say no, N-O, just say no, K-N-O-W, no. I think if we educate people, and again, that's part of prevention. I would also like to see, because when I go out and speak all over the country, there are people that come up to me head on and say, there's no proof that it's not. But my son was addicted. We were actively trying to get him off of marijuana. And, hopefully we'll work on that. But what I would like to see, because it's called recreational, is that maybe increasing the legal age from 21 to 25, at least give the brain a little bit more time to develop. Again, the train has left the station. There, states are loving the money that's coming in, so we're never going to reverse any of that. I think we're going to see all 50 states, but just if we can understand about brain development a little bit later, if people understand what they're getting, this is not your parents' marijuana. This is not the stuff that was grown out back. It's very potent.
Thank you. I think anybody else?
Yeah, I can add some facts to that. First of all, Mrs. Winnefeld just said it's very important. The marijuana that we used, some of us, when we were back then, was 3% THC. This is 12% THC, not 30 or 40% more, 400% more. So it's a different drug, number one.
Liquid form, too. In the
Ms. Winnefeld said the train has left the station, and I think my plane has left Reagan, but it was worth it to catch a later plane this afternoon, which I will do, to be here. And again, I want to thank you all from the bottom of my heart for being here for this very important hearing.
And one thing I would say, too, if we lost the number of people that Mr. Mandel mentioned every day to a terrorist attack, this country would be all over it. If it was Ebola wiping out that many people, we would be all over this. But again, so we need to lower the stigma. We need to confront mental health.
And I'd like to, Paula, do you have anything else you want to add? We haven't. Oops. Go ahead now. The audio's working.
Thank you. I would just like to encourage the availability for Suboxone, that more physicians would be able to prescribe it. It is on one of your bills, I believe.
It is, and we raised that limit before, but we're having that discussion about is that the right number, and so we appreciate that. Ms. Mandel, and I've got
very quickly to add to that point, and it picks up what Mrs. Winnefeld just said. 53,000 young men and women lost their lives in the Vietnam War over 10 years. The next 10 years, it's projected we're going to lose 500,000 people related to an overdose. That's 10 times. If this, and let's just say it were even, not even 10 times, we would mobilize our country for a war, for a situation. Yes, there are many reasons why there's not enough doctors prescribing buprenorphine or Suboxone. Many reasons why they're not following evidence-based treatment. But we can do it, right? We can do it. We can pass the Results Act in some form. We can mobilize, and right now it's an 8-hour training for doctors to prescribe buprenorphine. Does it have to be 8 hours? And even if it stays 8 hours, can we say by next January, in 4, 5, 6 months, every doctor has to take that 8 hours and be able to prescribe buprenorphine? That could be done. We would do that if that were a war and we were mobilizing our country. This is solvable.
That's why it's been our #1 priority for the committee. Mr. Gray?
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to throw one last comment in again before we conclude, in that, once again, we continue to talk about the classical problem of the process of addiction through heroin and opioids. Fentanyl changes this whole thing. Right. And I'm here trying to represent the people who are not necessarily going down that path, who are being slaughtered.
Right.
And so this is a problem of an incredible level of urgency due to the addition of these synthetic opioids, right? So, and that is getting at all, that's vectoring to new places that would have come and gone in the past, and they're dying. So I just want to make sure that we keep focused on that the urgency and the numbers we're talking about, the numbers that Mr. Mandel is talking about, are being contributed by people who wouldn't have been caught in this in the past because of the synthetic opioid. It is the catalyst that is turning this thing into a conflagration.
And our colleague, Mr. Katko from Syracuse, who prior to coming here busted drug rings and drug dealers as part of his effort as a
Absolutely.
One thing I would add is, coming from a long military background and working a lot with our Special Forces friends, and I know an area that my husband and I are very interested in is using some of the technology that we have on the military side to help with those interdictions. There's some great stuff out there, facial recognition, some of the other classified stuff that we've actually even talked with the CIA about. And it would be wonderful to use that, because this is a war.
You know,
even though we
Dr.
like to call it the war on drugs.
Yeah, Dr. Burgess went up to the big processing facility, I think, in New Jersey to look at, because a lot of it's coming in through the U.S. mail.
Yes.
Dr. Gottlieb, that heads the FDA, doubled the number of people just as soon as he got there that could be put toward this task. We've increased funding in the omnibus to add more interdiction capability, so we're trying, this is a multifaceted approach. That's why there are 60 pieces of legislation we're trying to work through, from HIPAA to results to interdiction. One of the things Mr. Katko argued is that they will change out in that synthetic opioid process, synthetic fentanyl, faster than the law can keep up. And so we're trying to close that loophole, but you have to be careful when you do that, because guess what? You could make medical research illegal if you don't get it right. To Mr. Griffith's point about these are you get into the weeds in it like we have to do to get it right, but we also want to get it done. And so we get criticized sometimes for moving too fast, believe it or not. We are going to get this done, and we appreciate your participation. And
just real quick,
if you want to wrap
one of the bills up, and this was brought up, I believe, by Chairman Burrs, Medicare and Medicaid.
Right.
I put people in treatment all the time, okay? If they have insurance, I can get them into treatment. If they're indigent, they're actually easier to get into treatment. Medicaid and Medicare are almost impossible, and that has to change because that's a huge population. We have got to work on that.
Yeah, we had our third in the series now with this panel, fourth of hearings, was specifically focused on the problems related to Medicaid and Medicare. That was the hearing that took place about a week ago or so. So that, I appreciate that, and any input you have on the legislation we're looking at there would be most helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I might just follow up on your comment.
Yeah, if it's real quick, because
very quick on your comment about the fentanyl and the analogs.
Yep.
And I think a lot of you are aware of this now because of this CITCO and CITSA and some of the other things.
Right.
Just so you know, we're also talking about a lot of discussion about detection capability in the field. That's something I do professionally as well. So anything anybody wants to know about that any further, I have a lot of that experience and have a lot of access to people who do. So let's keep that dialogue going as well, because I like to call it the whack-a-mole game. I deal with it in a different legislation as well, where they twist these organic compounds and make new things. So you're doing great work to shut that down, and I can aid in that.
yeah, when Dr. Burgess was up at the mail distribution facility, they got into the weeds in some of the technology that is there, some of it that's available, but not everywhere. So you're continuing to put on
I'm
that.
very much in those weeds, so yeah, good.
Excellent. I want to thank you all again, our deepest sympathies for your losses. We benefit greatly from your time here, and you have our commitment that we will move forward to the best of our ability as rapidly and judiciously as possible to get ahead of this deadly, deadly scourge in America. So thank you. And we are adjourned.
He was in a private facility, sober homes, I guess through the IOP that he had met this guy. No, it was actually, there's a question of the name of the house and how it, he's so one of our EOBs came in as Journey to Recovery, but they said the name of the house that he was living in was Sea of Recovery. The only ones that knew that was the name was the police and us. That's what Jamie knew. Then they called it drug zone. They were just busted a couple months ago. So not really. There's like ties to Ireditch and around Delray and Boynton Beach. Yeah. So there was a Dr. McGovern and a Dr. Joe. Basically, thank you so much. Thank you. So I know once he got out of the private facility, he was at Beachway therapy. I'm bringing Sherry. He's over the phone. I just want to thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it.